Salutations to the Truth Core, whoever or wherever you may be on the planet. The planet, by the way, is an anamorph. ANAMORPH. Go look it up. The provable fact that the planet looks different depending on the frame of perception is due to a dynamic principle of the universe. In Sanskrit, that principle is called Mahamaya, the power of framing. Now, today I'm coming at you with a little riff titled, Myth is Racist, and so am I. Generally, of course, due to the dementia of humanity in the year 2020, the stage of dementia that humanity has reached, it is universally bad to be a racist. So the term is rarely used except as a condemnation. But I am living refutation of that slander. I can show you a case for racism in the positive sense that is totally irrefutable. So I would start out with a little syllogism. Mythology is racist. John is a mythologist. Therefore, John is racist. Needless to say, to back up that syllogism, I have to explain how mythology is racist. Well, that explanation is going to be short and sweet, I can guarantee you that. It is an irrefutable fact that no myth or mythic narrative has come into the world except through a particular or specific race. So the origin of all myths is racial. You cannot find any myth that is not racial, that does not come from a particular people of a particular time and culture, and that authors of the myth, if you'd like to call them that, have a specific racial identity which cannot be denied. For instance, it would be ridiculous to claim that the mythology of the Japanese people is in some way universal or irrespective of race. It would be ridiculous to claim that race is irrelevant to the mythology of the Japanese people or any people. Why so? Because the racial narratives that exist in the world come from specific racial groups. So mythology is racist. Now, to develop this little riff to its spectacular conclusion, I propose an exercise in visualization. Suppose you're standing with me and I invite you into the mythologist's study. So picture it as quite a large room. In some respects, it would have to be a warehouse. And as you enter the room, you see around three sides, right, left, and the wall opposite, you see many books. And then you also see cases and drawers which contain artifacts, articles, paintings, sculptures, amulets. And all of these are evidence of mythology. So, of course, I don't have objects like that actually in my studio, but I do have the books. So suppose you're in the studio with me, and I bring you up to a large table in the middle of the room. And on this table, I've set out 42 files. 40 of these files, let's say 5 times 8, are arranged in 5 rows with 8 files in each row. And I've also set out on the table a 12-volume set of books, which are standard reference books for those who work in my genre, which is creative mythology. And the title of this 12-volume set is The Mythology of All Races. Now, as we approach the table and look down, I point out to you that each one of the files in the 5 rows, making 40 total, has a title on it. And the title refers to a race or a race and culture combined, because certain cultures are unique to their race, to the race that produced them. So, for instance, the Aztec culture is unique to the racial and ethnic group that produced it. So we're standing there looking over this material, and I have the great pleasure to tell you something that I discovered. I call it my greatest discovery in comparative mythology. It took many years to make this discovery, decades, beginning with my first encounter with mythology at the age of 10. And so I can tell you with great pleasure what I have discovered that may be of benefit to you, or at the very least, it may be entertaining. To relate my discovery as concisely as possible, I do have to introduce you to a couple of technical terms in the jargon of creative mythology. One of these terms is race-specific, and that term is self-explanatory. It applies to these folders. You look at the folder that says Persian. Look at the folder that says Hindu/Indian, or the folder that says Greek or Chinese. And obviously the contents of the folder is race-specific. Now comes the fun part. I want you to consider the word origin. The material in each of these dossiers has a specific origin, which again is racial, cultural, and associated with a particular place. Japanese mythology comes from that race, and it comes from the islands of Japan, which they inhabit. The same is true of every single dossier. So in the first place, origin refers to what you may call the authorship of the myths, of the mythic narratives. Next, consider the term origin myth. The origin myth is a class or category that is common to all these mythic narratives. In the total range of these narratives, you'll find that each example contains an origin myth. The origin myth describes the origin of the human species. Or does it? Hold on to that question for a moment. What, in fact, do these examples of origin myths really show? Well, in the first place, every origin myth is race-specific due to its source in a certain ethnic group, speaking a certain language, and located in a certain place on the earth. That's clear. That's irrefutable. Then when you look into the narrative of the origin myths of each of these particular cases, you find that the origin myth also is race-specific. That assertion is a conclusion that one draws after having made the total survey of the total inventory of world mythology. So it's a judgment call, it's a professional call, but I invite anyone to challenge me on the accuracy of that statement. For example, the myth of the Persian people that originates with their racial group describes the origin of the Persian people. The origin myth is race-specific. The mythology of the Chinese, of the Slavic peoples, or of, say, the Greeks, the Etruscans, the Egyptians, and so on through all of the categories of the 42, maybe, describe the origins of the race that produced the myth. So you find that the origin myths are race-specific. Can you see that? It doesn't matter how far you look, and it doesn't matter what the differences in culture are. For instance, the Mayan origin myth, which is found in the Popol Vuh, describes the origin of the Mayan peoples. The Persian origin myth, found in the Avestas, describes the origin of the Persian peoples. The Nordic myth, found in the languages of Old Norse and the Icelandic Eddas and the Kalevala of Finland, that is to say Scandinavian myth, describes the origin of the various Scandinavian peoples. And in some cases, not all, you find that the mythic narrative gives a name to the, quote, first people, or the first human being. For instance, in Persian myth, it's Gayomart. And in Nordic myth, it's Ymir. Doesn't happen in all cases, but some of the dossiers contain evidence which names or gives a name to the first people. But in all these cases, the first people are the people who produced the myth. So what you see, what you can conclude, and what I have concluded, I consider to be irrefutable, is that these myths only describe the origin of the races that produced them, and they do not describe the origin of the human race in its totality. They do not claim to describe the origin of the human species. If you had a mythic narrative that described the origin of the human species, it would not be race-specific. It would be generic. See the difference? By generic, I mean applicable to humanity as a whole. Now, I operate on the premise, or I operate using a consistent syntax that states that there is one human species and many races. So to speak of the human race is not accurate. To speak of the human races, called the Rome, is accurate. So we're standing in front of the table and I'm waving my hand over all these files and I'm saying, you know, it's pretty interesting what I discovered after many years. The observation, it's just an observation that I was able to make by immersing myself in this genre for so long. So I can tell you with confidence that this is a fact. It is an irrefutable fact. If we go and open the dossier with a title, say, Oceanic Myth, or Polynesian Myth, or Melanesian Myth, you will find that the various creation myths or origin myths only describe the origin of those people who are the authors of the myth. That being so, this study this comprehensive study of world mythology begs a question. How come there is not any race-specific myth that describes a generic scenario of the creation of the human species, or to be more exact, the human genome? How come? Now, believe me, my friends, if you can ask that question and know what you're asking, you stand at the very summit of the genre of creative mythology. And the answer to that question is, well, in fact, there are myths which are generic. There are origin myths which do describe the origin, the source, the creation, if you will, of the entire human species, not just of the race who produced the myth. You might recall that I said there are 42 dossiers on the table. So as you stand there and look down at it, you see the 40 of them in those 5 rows of 8. And then I have set aside, above and apart from all the others, 2 other dossiers. So the fact is, the grand conclusion that comes with this discovery is that there are 2 exceptional cases, 2 and 2 only. And in those cases, the origin myths, although they are race-specific, because mythology is racist, and all myths have to come from a certain people who speak a certain language and live in a certain area of the world, nevertheless, there are 2 races who have produced generic origin myths that describe the creation of the entire human species and not just of the race who produced the myth. I trust I'm not being too repetitive here. I don't want to grind it into your mind, but I certainly do want to bring to your attention the outstanding and unique fact that there are 2 generic origin myths, and 2 only. So let's set aside all the other 40 dossiers, put them in a stack at the end of the table, and bring down to the front of the table these 2 files. What are the names on these 2 files? So are you intrigued? Do I have your attention? Well, great, because I do want to reach you with this discovery I've made, and I cannot exaggerate or overestimate how important this discovery is. And I cannot exaggerate the significance of these 2 anomalous myths, which, above and beyond all the other myths that you might examine, have the greatest impact on what is happening in the world today. So that's it. That's my discovery. And if you care and dare to find out what are the titles on those 2 files, well, how about this? You just hang on to your jammies until the next little rift. And in that talk, I will explicitly describe and name these 2 myths, and we together will look into the unique content that they contain, and by extension, we'll look at their unique significance, and indeed the unique power that these 2 myths exert upon the world today So that's coming in the next talk to follow up this one. Enough said, and I'll be seeing you in the beauty to come.